Hey guys, so good evening and welcome back to another session where we're going to look in and around how to manage a lot of different related injuries and conditions, and maybe how we look at sort of strapping those. We'll go through the lower limb initially, and then we'll go through the upper limb taping techniques after that. So I'm just going to do a bit of an intro to give you a bit of an insight. If you guys are just logging on now, quite a lot of the people attending tonight are just starting to drop on the chat group just to give their names, introduce yourselves. Please feel free to kind of have a bit of a chat amongst yourselves, see what's going on. And also just a big thank you to Physique Management who are sponsoring the session. If you guys aren't familiar with Physique, they are huge in the world of taping. They've supplied every single place that I've had that I've worked at. So it's been right across sort of professional rugby. It's been all the way across British gymnastics. It's in British judo. It's right across the UK Sports Institute because the quality is really, really second to none. You can obviously buy stuff elsewhere. For me, it definitely hands down is the best. Um, they've kindly let you sort of use my discount code if you want to use it. So if you do go on the Physique website and sort of think, oh, I wouldn't mind grabbing a few bits and pieces to practice with, please feel free to drop me a message or drop them a message to see what you might need. But you can use the code Grow Physio that's just there in the bottom right hand corner. I'm not going to bore you with this, but this is my overview of my sort of career so far since qualifying. So on the left-hand side is where I sort of started. And then as I've gradually moved through, sort of being involved with a few Commonwealth Games and in Olympics, and then obviously kind of the most recent Paris Olympics, working with the British Judo Olympic and Paralympic teams there. So lots and lots of strapping that I've done over the years. I think when I walked into the rugby world, I was astounded at how much strapping you needed to do. So again, I'm going to try and show you a lot of the techniques that were pretty bread and butter for us by the end. And we'd often have three physios on a home game, arriving about an hour and a half beforehand, few treatments, but majority sort of strapping based with a squad of sort of 25-ish athletes. Um, the other thing that I have is this baby, which is my sort of business. It is a opportunity for people who are maybe transitioning into sport or are sort of just moving into sport and want to just upskill a little bit more. Some of the insights into sort of what the world of sport has looked like for me over about the last sort of 12 to 13 years, really in various different professional environments. So please feel free to have a little look at the Grow Physio Academy that is on there. It currently has a new look. So if there's a lot of the members who are joining us tonight, it now looks like this. We've tried to kind of modernize it, make it a little bit easier for all of you guys to kind of work your way through. It's just packed full of things that I wish that I'd known before I kind of moved into sports. So I didn't have to ask those awkward questions. And it's almost just a little bit like an apprenticeship, really. And we have a couple of students working with us, a couple of sports therapists in the British judo world, but we still get countless numbers of requests. And unfortunately, we just can't give them to everybody. So this is kind of the way that I try to share a lot of the things that I wish that I'd known. So if you do want to have a little look inside, then please do delve into that. It's packed full of lots of different courses. So there's applied testing and screening for athletes is what we went through last time. And then again, sort of within the academy, all the members have access to all of these webinars for free and all the past ones as well. So it really kind of works out pretty good value at about £15 a month. But this is what we're here for. So just to kind of give you a quick little insight into some of the terminology, if you haven't seen this. So anchors are usually the bits of tape that you stick things to. So skin is not particularly sticky. So it's better if you're adhesing tape onto other tape. You've got stirrups that you saw there. These would be 6s. These would be 8s that you've got there. And then we've got some little ATFL strips that what you might find is that athletes request certain different variations. You'd never put all of this on. But hopefully it gives you a little bit of an idea of some of the options that you can do. And then anterior strips just basically sit on the front. Now, I'm going to go through this in way more detail later on and much slower, but just to kind of give you a little bit of a flavour in terms of what sorts of things we'll be going through. I've just literally released this. So on the 9th of November, if you finish this and go, oh, I'd really like Steve to kind of guide me through in person, actually have a chance to tape lots and lots of different things. I feel a bit awkward maybe doing it straight away with patients or athletes. In Birmingham at our National Training Centre, what you'll find is that I'm going to go through a lot of the similar techniques, but it'll give you a lot more clinical reasoning behind why we do it. So that's why I'm kind of looking like a little penguin on some of these, and then almost kind of trying to explain the things that maybe contribute to the problem, rather than it purely being just a sports taping sort of course, really. So if you are interested, please feel free to kind of scan that QR code on the right-hand side. The link's also in the chat group. If you do want to come, you can have the money back that you spent on this webinar, and then obviously you can kind of use that towards it. So it'd be great to get as many of you guys there as possible. And if you've got any questions on that, just let me know. But Saturday, the 9th of November, 9:30 till 4. Now, I'm going to open this up to the group, really. So why do you guys think that we tape? What are some of the reasons? So in that chat group, just have a brainstorm. Please don't go all mute and shy. Everyone will be thinking the same sorts of things. Just bang in there. What are some of the reasons why you think in practice we tape? Yeah, perfect, Kerry. Great start. Support a joint. What else we got? Help support injuries. Yeah, stabilize joints, increase player confidence, support stability. Exactly, yeah. That's kind of one big sort of physical reason, isn't it? So around a joint, if you've got a ligament that's potentially vulnerable, inhibition of muscles, psychological factors, definitely. So psychologically, depending on how people are through that rehabilitation, what the magnitude of the game is, what they're like personality-wise, they may well just want to have some taping put on. Now, we've had scenarios where we've rehabilitated someone really, really well. They've ticked off all their markers. They've gone back into full training and been fine, but maybe on a match day or a competition day, all that they've wanted is to strap that affected joint. And for me, I'm absolutely fine with that. As long as you feel like they're ready to go back, then why not sort of add a little bit of extra sensory input, proprioception sorts of things in and around there. As long as it doesn't interfere, increase the risk of sort of secondary injuries, etc., then why not? If they're psychologically a bit better, then they're probably going to be a little bit happier, aren't they? There's some of the reasons. Any other reasons that anyone wants to spitball out here in terms of things that can, reasons why you might do it? We'll put inhibition of muscles. So that might be some of the sort of chat in and around kinesio dynamic taping possibilities. So there is that as well. Grand. Let's see. So these are some of the things which I think it helps with. So improving biomechanics, external support you guys talked about, might be psychological, superstitious, might be someone that's just always had the same physio or sports therapist taping it at exactly the same time. Again, absolutely fine. It might be used to attach things. So quite often if people have got dead legs, they might be attaching bits of foam, might be attaching, if it's really bad, bits of kind of car sponges, these dermal pads, whatever it may be. Anatomical advantage, just for a little bit of reference, is usually what you'll find is in the inner mid-ranges that the muscle will create more torque compared to maybe those outer ranges. So if we limit some of those positions or put them in a more anatomically advantageous position, then you might well find that you get better recruitment, you get better performance, better function, better efficiency, etc. So the classic one I kind of use sometimes is if someone has a really overpronated foot, it's really not very good control of that supination eccentrically. What might well happen is that tib posterior can't work quite as well. So if we kind of almost take them out of that position where that foot is completely splatting on the floor, then what you might find is that tib post is in a slightly better position out of its outer range and can work a little bit better. Pain, no one mentioned. So obviously kind of from a pain perspective, looking after things acutely, really useful, might well just reduce the amount of kind of friction anywhere that's potentially sort of rubbing and causing some problems on there. Proprioception and joint position sense, the more input sensory-wise you have in and around something, really useful. Some purists will look at sort of lymphatic flow and the recovery side of things with K-tape. So in theory, if you put tape on stretch, what will happen is it will recoil a little bit, lift that top layer of skin, and then you'll get a better amount of lymphatic flow underneath. There's some photographs that if you kind of search on Google and things can show you that a little bit. I think if you've got that much bruising, that much swelling, they're probably little 1%ers for me. We had fashion as a key thing as well. So within our rugby world, we had quite a lot of the All Blacks. The All Blacks would only wear black tape, etc. And sometimes they just bang it on for fashion. sometimes they'd actually use it to write little plays and things on that they were working on. So in a very American footballery kind of fashion, lots of different plays, they'd write down what they need, and it's similar in rugby. And improved performance is pretty key. Now, this is, I think, what's kind of really sort of thrust onto the scene probably about 10, 15 years ago, when K-tape was sort of spotted. People started looking at all these colourful different bits and pieces that you can use. Again, the colour for me makes absolutely no difference, but what you might find is someone like Gareth Bale there who's got a sky blue coloured bit of tape on. The referee may not allow that. They may require it to be the same colour as the kit. So might just be worth bearing that in mind. You can see the sort of extreme example there with the Italian in there. Now, again, just in that chat group, if you guys can just answer this really, when should taping be used? And is acute management something that you would potentially use it in? So it might just be a yes or a no. Might be a little bit more what sorts of things acute wise. So let's say you're working pitch side, somebody goes down, they're maybe on the pitch or they're potentially coming off the pitch. What sorts of things might you use the tape for? Again, just have a little spitball in that chat group. Anything that you've used it for before. Perfect, Emily. Yep. So swelling control, really good. So if you've got an ankle and it's the first time that they've potentially rolled that ankle, you might get a good flood of fluid coming into that lateral ankle region. If you put a horseshoe on, which is like a little foam horseshoe underneath, and then compress it, what you might find is that they don't swell quite as much. So getting rid of that swelling later on, really, really useful, isn't it? Support the joint, exactly, yeah. To strap gauze to wounds, perfect. Plantar fasciitis, yeah, all possibilities that you can use it for. And then Raymond, yeah, limit excess inversion for an ankle sprain, for example. So that's probably the most typical one, isn't it? So someone who's rolled their ankle, they're a little bit sore, you strap it in a position that it doesn't stress the lateral structures on that ankle, ATFL, CFL predominantly. And actually you can avoid some of those plantar flexion inversion positions, can't you, that maybe stress things. Scar management as well as a possibility. Great stuff. Well done, guys. I like your style. So some of the things that you might well sort of see happen is ideally, if you've got someone who's got a big ankle injury, you'll have one of these air cast boots that you use. So you inflate the inside, splints it, and then it can't move anywhere. You go either non-weight bearing or touch weight bearing with something like a set of crutches. And you might well have braces and things, but not everybody will have these things. So it has been the case in the past where I've maybe had something like a syndesmosis injury or a big ankle injury, lateral structures, and I've just taped it to try and look after it to optimize the environment for that healing to take place. Grand. In a match day setting as well, we've talked a little bit in and around that already. So if you've got any more answers that you want to add, then please do add them in that chat group. But you might well have seen this happen. So on a pitch, there isn't enough time necessarily to take the boot off, take the socks off, take the shin pad off, strap it, etc., while the game's going on, because the players would be down to 10 men or 14 men, depending on the sport that it was. Now, for me, that isn't the optimal way to do it, but you'll see this quite a lot. Usually they use something like an EAB to try and control it. But normally that gives them a little bit of stability, maybe to get to half time or until there's a big break in play where you can maybe strap it a little bit better. Or the reality is, if it's an injury of that magnitude, they've maybe done a few checks while the adrenaline's still pretty high, and gradually that performance deteriorates, and then the manager ends up hauling them off because they're not doing a very good job. Grant, from a sort of injury prevention perspective, there's a little bit of a question mark about should we be using strapping prophylactically. So netball is a sport where they get a never-ending amount of ankle sprains. So what you'll find is a lot of them will wear these supports on the right-hand side. Some people may not like that. Some people will prefer to be taped, but it can obviously kind of become quite costly, quite time-consuming to tape all of these athletes. Now, there has been chats in and around, should we just tape everybody? Because the eventuality is they will eventually end up getting some sort of sprain in that ankle. Now, I don't do that. I think that would be a little bit overkill. I'd rather go down an injury prevention, prehab sort of route, get them as strong as they possibly can. But again, depending on the sports that you guys are in, that might be something that you consider. And the other thing just to consider really is throughout that journey, this is a chap whose shoulder popped out on one side and went back in again, so it's subluxed, came out, had a labral tear that was associated with it. But again, in rehab, this is a judo athlete, just for reference, lots of throwing that's involved. He'll get his arm caught in lots of funny positions. We do a whole host of rehab to make sure that area of his body and trunk and everything else that feeds into it are as good as they possibly can be. Because if he does get caught again, you want to have the physical qualities to make sure that he's all right to cope with that. And then we back that up with some numbers and testing and compare that injured side to non-injured side, etc. So it might be you've gone through that whole journey and taping is just that extra little adjunct that you use. And lastly, just before we get into some of the sort of nitty gritty of it all, really, when we talk about injuries and reoccurrences, clearly what we have is a neural system. So you can become quite centrally sensitized if an area was always painful. So if it's always painful, it's always feeding into that sort of central nervous system. Things can become quite sensitized. The the brain starts to listen more to an area. So actually, if you get on top of it really early, stop them developing those painful signs, you may well stop that whole occurrence going on. And again, it might be that someone who's managed it really well takes a bit of a knock or goes into a certain position, gets a little bit of pain, but cracks on. Might be someone who's had constant development of chronic pain, but then that becomes more of that sort of car alarm effect where someone kind of comes near them, they go into some of these injury positions and they get a really sort of amplified reaction. Now, I don't want to burst anyone's bubbles here, but if you will get some haters to do with taping, if you've had taping on, you'll know that it does certainly restrict things, but the evidence isn't fantastic in and around taping. There's a few structures that it does have some reasonable evidence in, but I don't know how you can, because everybody will have different injuries, different anatomy, so the patient's going to be very different genders, sports, etc. You're going to probably have a different therapist. And even if you have the same therapist, they may well strap it slightly differently. And again, lots of different variables like the surface they're playing on, 4Gs versus grass, etc. But again, from my perspective, it's something which is a mainstay in sport. If you're working in sport, no doubt someone will end up asking you to strap something. I think it's a great adjunct. It's something that if you worked on something in clinic, made a change, maybe you put some tape on just to kind of continue that over carry into sort of a longer effect, really. But there are some advantages and disadvantages to taping versus something like a brace, for example. So have a little think. What advantages might there be potentially with using taping over something like a brace? What might be a disadvantage of that tape, really? Again, if you want to ping anything into that chat group, then please do so. What sorts of things are better and advantageous for using tape over something that's more of a off-the-shelf kind of buy, really? Anyone got any thoughts? Don't be shy. More personalized, Pedro, brilliant. Yeah, so you can bespoke the technique however you want. You might well potentially look at a fairly secure strapping and then gradually wean off a little bit as time goes on, maybe as they're going through rehab or as they get more confident with more games, etc. So they're really useful. You can be a lot more almost individualized exactly with that. A few other things that are potentially quite useful just to take in mind is obviously kind of the difference between a brace and taping is that once you get quite sweaty or if it's rainy or you've got a hairy athlete or whatever, the likelihood is that the beneficial secure feel that you get with the taping initially might well just start to deteriorate as they go through that warm up and come the game it might not feel quite as tight. So when you're putting that on, again, you're getting feedback all the way through to see what's happening, and then just acknowledge that it's probably going to start to deteriorate. Other ones are on there really, so obviously kind of the cost of taping. If you're doing that every single session, every single day of training, if they're training 5 times a week and you strap their ankle 5 times a week versus maybe using something like a brace, the brace is going to be the much cheaper, longer term option compared to taping. But you might find that people who've got allergies to tape, plasters, etc., it's just not appropriate to take them, and their brace is the best option that you have. So in terms of applying this, let's assume that we have gone through sort of some checks and things. These are what I would really consider before you're strapping anything. So The mechanism of injury, really important. If we take the ankle that we talked about before, plantar flexion inversion, classic one, isn't it, for that ankle lateral ligaments to become injured. So therefore, what is the safer position to tape it in? If I tape them all the way in dorsiflexion and eversion, they're not going to be able to run. So we have to find something that functionally works. The ligament's not going to get torn in that dorsiflex everted position, but the likelihood is they're going to not wear it because they're so functionally restricted that they can't do it. That ties into the anatomical structures. Again, what can you do to protect them? And what are you trying to do to sort of almost limit the movement into those positions where it's quite sore? Other things are whether it's an acute injury, a chronic injury, is it someone who's carrying current pain symptoms, apprehensive about it from a psychological perspective. And then we think about what materials we use, and we'll go through all of that in a little bit just to familiarize yourself in terms of what's happening. Right, over to you guys. So what is the first phase? Let's say we've got consent from the athlete, and then they're on the bed, they're about to be strapped. What do we need to think about in terms of what is the first stage of that process? So think about all the things that we thought about there with anatomy, potential injury mechanism. What is the first stage that we're going to kind of almost do with this athlete? So you've wiped off all the gunk that's on the floor as they've walked through the changing room. They've got all the bits of grit and grime and everything like that. That's all been brushed off. You've got their consent. You've asked them whether they've got any allergies. What else are we going to have a little look at? Comfortable position. Yeah. So certainly to do with the position that they're in. So what I would do is position that joint in the place where there's going to be a functional usage, but also so you're not limiting them completely, but you're still going to look after those tissues. Next stage is apply an anchor. So more often than not, you will always want to go from tape to tape. Tape to skin won't stick quite as well if you're trying to add tension. It will probably just pull off unless you anchor it all down really well afterwards. But the vast majority of the time, you use an anchor. If you're not sure what an anchor is, you will do by the end of this. Basically, just a piece of tape that if you are applying somewhere else for it to stick onto. Thing to be mindful of with that is just if you are potentially going circumferential, just be very careful you don't put that on too tight. Thinking about neurovascular supply, etc., that you might be cutting off. Then I'd just be thinking in and around sort of how you apply that taping. So what angle, what tension are you going to apply that with? Don't forget, if you're using something like zinc oxide, you can add a bit more pull to take it into some of those positions which are going to support it a little bit better. The higher risk ones, if it's a cup final, you've got your captain, he's got a little minor sort of ATFL grade 1, but he is playing no matter what. What can you do to protect that area the best that you can? Next is just to make sure that you don't leave any gaps in between the tape. So the skin will start to protrude through the tape. If you leave any little gaps, particularly if you've got a joint that's mobile, what will happen is the skin pokes through, it starts to cut, it creates a bit of a paper cut or a bit of a blister, and they'll really be quite unhappy. So make sure you're sort of overlapping with the tape as you go. And then we're just checking in on that neurovascular status. So bonuses for what are we doing? So let's say that we have an ankle, we've just strapped the ankle. How are we checking whether they still have an alive foot? Check cap refill. Perfect, Hallie, well done. So cap refill is the classic. People talk about pulses and things like that as well if you're really worried. But the easiest one, to be fair, is just squeeze that nail bed, see if it refills at the same pace as the one next to it, or the unstrapped one. And it should be within 2 seconds. Grand. So just to let you know, this is where I'm going to share the material with you from. So this is a sports taping practical course. We'll go through the lower limb first, then into the upper limb. And basically what I'll do is I'll play the first bit. You'll see why. So it's edited. It would take hours to go through everything. But you'll see sort of going through this practically, me talking through what I'm doing all the way, hopefully explains it. But if you've got any questions that you want to ask, we'll do that. Do it as you go along. I'll put them in the chat group. But I'll be jumping back on again in about an hour's time. And then what we'll do is we'll go into the upper limb and then repeat that with the same sort of process. The whole entire thing is recorded. So you can set this up in clinic or practice in your wherever you are. I would really recommend doing this with rolls of tape in hand if you possibly can, so you get a bit of a feel. It's very easy to watch things and go, oh, that's how you do it. Unless you're really familiar with taping, you might get a bit cack-handed. You might not be quite sure on the angles. So yeah, definitely really recommend sort of rewatch this when you've got tape in hand. And this is just me. So this is where you'll find the academy. So www.growphysioacademy.com. I'm on socials as well, probably most active on LinkedIn and Instagram, just trying to share some of these little videos. But what I will do is I'll share with you the first lower limb practical, unless anyone's got any questions that they desperately want to ask right now. Otherwise, what I'll do is I'll fly into this. I hope you really enjoy it. Hopefully you do. Let me just clear a couple of things and then get going. Right, you're all set. So let's minimize this, minimize that. Right, enjoy. Hey, hi everybody, and welcome back to Grow Physio. So this webinar is going to focus on the sport-specific taping for the lower limb. So we're going to address some of the theory that is related, but the predominant side of this is practical. So whether or not you want to get your taping materials and your adjuncts and things at the ready, whether you want to watch the whole thing first, you may want to pause and rewind some elements of this so you can practice some of these techniques. So what are we going to run through? So we'll look at the anatomy and the injury mechanism so we know whatever we're trying to protect in terms of a strapping application, where that is and what the common injuries may be. We'll talk about preparing the skin and the precautions that are associated, and we'll also look at the materials and the adjuncts that we use. Then we'll fire into a lot of those strapping techniques. Some of them will be stability based, so we're almost locking together joints, and then we've got the dynamic side of that where we look at more facilitation of that soft tissue. Then, as ever, we'll go through a summary at the end. Now, just a little bit on me. So my name's Steve Miller and I've set up growphysio.com. My background over the last 6 years was here. So I worked for Newcastle Falcons in Premiership Rugby in England. And during that time, obviously, athletes of various shapes and sizes present. Rugby has a lot of trauma-related injuries for obvious reasons. And therefore, you end up doing a lot of taping. So I've adapted a lot of very traditional techniques, made some of my own up, and then come up with some variations that hopefully you'll find quite useful. So it is important to acknowledge that you do have athletes who are very agile, lots of sort of high speed, dynamic elements. You've got your jumping athletes. You've also got your big, strong athletes who are obviously big impact, big collisions. So it's no wonder we get injured, really. Now, some of the other techniques have come from Olympic Games that I've worked at, where I worked with the volleyball athletes in 2012, and then also things like the Glasgow Commonwealths with the hockey athletes there. Now, why do we tape? So the obvious answer is that it provides external support. When you lock an ankle together, or you potentially look at stabilizing a ligamentous structure, then obviously you're going to have reduced motion, ideally preventing the mechanism of injury reoccurring again. So you may actually want to sacrifice a little bit of mobility in order to almost reduce the injury risk. For some athletes, it's very psychological. They may have had an injury, and then following that injury for game days, they have always been strapped up. Now, in that sort of situation, again, it may be that this tissue is healed completely and actually they have enough stability. But if the athlete is requiring it, I don't see there being really any harm in adding some of the psychological side of the benefits of strapping as well. Now, that can be linked again to little superstitions that athletes have. They will typically have their own routines that they go through during a game. They may want their own physio or their consistent physio or sports therapist or trainer strapping that appropriate body part because they haven't been injured before. They maybe like the way that it feels. And again, if you haven't worked with an athlete, just ask how they want it. Get them to give you feedback, and then you can adapt it as times go on. Now, it might be, if you've got the option to do it in training, if it's a new group that you're working with, that actually you want to do a trial run in training, and then they can give you some feedback rather than being unhappy on game day. Strapping can also give you an anatomical advantage, and I think if we think about the foot and ankle, really, if you've got a foot that is really overpronated, that tib posterior maybe is in that sort of extended position, it's less anatomically advantageous for it to be in that outer range. So what we may need to do is, rather than just focus on the tib post in that sort of example, is look at stabilizing the rear foot, bringing that into neutral, so then you've got a tib post that can work a bit more effectively. Proprioceptive benefits are widespread, so be that a stabilizing strapping technique, or whether that is a facilitatory strapping where you've got your dynamic tapes around that soft tissue. The input that you have into it from a sensory perspective is going to help the athlete more often than not to have additional stimulus around there. So therefore, if they go into a more vulnerable position, they may have more input from a sensory perspective that they can then activate and sort of almost prevent that injury. There's reams of thought. Obviously, taping can be a really useful element of recovery. So some interesting sort of spider web style techniques that are on there following impacts like contusion injuries, or even sort of looking at the compressive side of taping and how we can get maybe some increased lymphatic mobility in there as well. And then on the back of that, really, you can obviously just have an athlete who wants it because it looks good. So sometimes your sort of strip or team colours, you can incorporate those in taping strategies. There may actually be stipulations from referees that you can't have a different coloured tape to your kit because it clashes with the opposition. So just thinking about skin preparation, really, so it needs to be clean. If you have treated that athlete beforehand, then you may have used oils, creams and things to try and treat it with some manual therapy, maybe loosen up the soft tissues, but that won't create a very good environment for that tape to adhere to. Now, if you've got a really hairy athlete, or potentially you are wanting that tape to stick a little bit better, you may need to reduce some of the hairiness that's there. So you might need to have like almost an electric shaver, like a sort of barbering shaver if you like, and then the next stage on from there really is to go into sort of almost a clean shave really. Now, I wouldn't advocate doing any clean shaving at all within about 12 hours probably of that application. So night before, if you are going to strap them, let the player or the athlete know that you're going to strap them, because otherwise the tape is likely to almost get into the pores, may well cause an infection and be quite sore and angry afterwards. But you can use pre-tape sprays, which are shown in that top right hand corner. That is a glue. It will increase the stickability of the tape. It will then last hopefully a little bit longer when you apply it. You might want to use some underwrap. So bottom left there, it's a bit more foamy. It's obviously a layer to protect your skin. So therefore, when you then apply the more adhesive glues and other products, then again, it won't irritate the skin. The problem with them, particularly with a lower limb, if you imagine it around a knee, is if you put an underwrap on, then someone comes and tackles that athlete potentially and pulls on that strapping, you're not going to have that adhesion onto the skin. So therefore it may well just end up flopping around that athlete's ankle really as it slides down the leg. You need to think about blisters and things as well. So clearly making sure that that skin prep is good and there's no creases and things on there. Now, there are a few little contraindications to think about. So if they are allergic to plasters or taping or glues, then again, you don't want to be putting these products on there. You also don't want to apply it over malignancy sites, cellulitis, any skin infections, and that includes open wounds and DVTs. A few precautions really. So diabetes in particular, for me, is a bit of a flag. You do get quite a few athletes who have diabetes and you will come across them. The reason being is you don't want to apply a circumferential application if you have potentially reduced neurovascular flow anyway. So if you're then occluding that even more, then again, you're going to potentially run the risk of developing some peripheral neuropathies. They may already have some reduced sensation that's in those distal extremities really. So with a diabetes thing, always make sure that you don't apply it circumferentially. Check the cap refill around the toes. Make sure you check pulses before and after the application. And then again, you've just got an extra layer when you document that in your notes that you've sort of taken the necessary stages really. In terms of skin protection, as I alluded to before, so you may have athletes who have blisters from rubbing off boots or changes in surfaces. Again, you want to try and protect them. If you tape over the top of them. As soon as they come to take that tape off, they are not going to thank you for it, because it's just going to rip off any skin that's trying to heal. Now, I really like these squares. They're like a second skin. You can use as many of them as you want. And again, you can build them up really. So they're sort of almost dice-sized squares, if you imagine the face of a dice. And then again, you can sort of just add them on. They also come in a circular format as well, that you can consider. But definitely, particularly around a foot and an ankle, making sure that you avoid any creases around there will help to reduce any crinkling of the skin, any nipping, and then therefore any sort of development of blisters. Now, the materials are explained in great detail in the next couple of slides, really. But just to familiarise yourself, so zinc oxide or sort of Lucatape, Lucaband are the sort of the brand that most people are aware of. It's very stable. There's no give in it by comparison to your EABs and your tear lights that are far lighter, far more manoeuvrable. So for locking in a joint, they're far more useful. And then again, you've got your Hyperfix, which it has a really adhesive underlayer. So therefore, you rip the tape off, pop it on, but it can also be used really usefully to almost stabilize your tape jobs. So once you've done your application, the worst thing is that it just comes off within milliseconds. So the Hyperfix can be a really useful tool to get that longevity and make it last. On that, what I also want to just highlight is really the preparation that you have before your athletes come in for strapping is important. If you've got a team, so we would have had a squad of sort of 26 players, and a vast majority of them would have required strapping in some shape or form. So do prepare. So you can see on the right hand side there, we've got all the little ankle pre-cuts that you'll see that we apply to the front and the back of that Achilles before we apply the taping. And again, if you've got all of those pre-cut, it's really useful, because then you're not constantly reaching for your scissors when other athletes are grabbing your bits and pieces as well. So do prep, do have it laid out. Some athletes will be able to strap themselves. So again, if they can access the materials, it's really useful to set all that up first, and it'll make your actual application and strapping sessions, which are often sort of an hour long in rugby with 2 or 3 of you working on athletes all that time, it'll make that smoother. But I just want to give you a bit of an insight into some of the materials that I use. If you are aware of all of the materials that's sort of demonstrated here, again, you might want to just fast forward 10 minutes into the sort of juicy strapping techniques, but you do need to know why we're using these products.
So what I'd like to do is just introduce you to some of the products and the materials that you might find in a strapping environment. So hopefully when you go to strap an athlete, you're a little bit more familiar with at least the products. Now, all of these products are supplied by Physique or Physique Management, who we used for our 6 seasons that I spent at Newcastle Falcons, and always found them a great quality product. So if we start over on the sort of left-hand side, really, so this is just an adhesive glue. So what you might find is that with a hairy athlete or a sweaty athlete, or it's raining, or they potentially are involved in sort of swimming, you may well need something like an adhesive glue that just gives a little bit more tactile property to the tape, so it lasts a little bit longer. You'll always find that tape feels really tight initially, and then once the athlete is warmed up in it, it's normally a more true account as to how that's going to feel during a game or a sort of sporting environment, really. So then if we come on to the zinc oxide strapping. So if you are strapping someone, have a little think about what you're trying to achieve. If you want to achieve stability in that joint, particularly zinc oxide is quite a good place to start. So it comes in 2 forms, really. So this one is a tiger tan strapping. This one is, again, just a white zinc oxide. We always use the tiger tan at Newcastle Falcons because I find it's a much better quality product. The difference, really, is that the tiger tan is a lot thicker in terms of its properties, so it's a lot more adhesive. It seems to give a lot more support to the athletes, and the feedback from them when you compare them, they're chalk and cheese, really. If you look at how easily this comes off the roll here, it just slides off, and the quality of it, you can almost see the thread count isn't anywhere near as high. So if you want to really stabilize a joint, zinc oxide is probably your way to go. I would always opt with this, which is like a tiger tan taping instead. Much better for adhesion, much better stability. It does come in different sizes, so that is probably the one which we use the most, which is about a 38mm. You can get a 2 centimetre or sort of 18mm version. That one would usually use for sort of toe strappings. And then this, if anyone asks, is a finger strapping. So this is about 1 centimetre, just under 1 centimetre thick, exactly the same properties. Players will typically apply this onto their own fingers, body strapping, that sort of thing. Then if we come on to your EAB, so your elastic adhesive bandages. So these, again, come in different sizes. They are more typically used as an overwrap over the top of something like a zinc to hold it all in place. But you can use this in isolation on its own. So if we look again at how that comes off the roll, there's a little bit of elastic nature to it. So it does have a little bit of give and a little bit of recoil. Now, again, the quality of this product is excellent, but you may find that, again, the thread count on them is a little bit different, which again just means you're not going to have quite that support that you'd have with a higher quality product there. Again, this comes in 7.5 centimetres, which is this one, which we normally use for things maybe like a bigger foot and ankle. We might use this to lock in some shoulders. And by comparison, you've got exactly the same product in a 5 centimetre range, which you usually use for wrists, heads, and maybe some smaller feet and ankles, really. This you struggle to tear. You can tear it, but it often ends up unravelling and it ends up a bit of a mess. So you may well have to use some scissors to do that. Now, there's a couple of different options that you have. You can obviously use something, just an off-the-shelf scissor for cutting things away from an athlete. These two are medical scissors or bandage scissors. This is a more bandage-related scissor. They're generally a little bit more flimsy, but they're sharper often in the actual blade themselves. And you may be able to see from there, they've got a slight little ridge here. So if you are cutting it near skin, you've got plenty of protection. I much prefer these ones. They're a lot more robust. Again, it has that little sort of snout or spout really that's on here, like a little plateau that you can get underneath the tape if you ever get to the point where you need to cut taping off, which is a formality in sport really. So I much prefer those. The other sizes that it tends to come in is this size, again just over 1 centimetre really. Sort of this is what we use for thumbs predominantly. So if you had sort of gamekeeper thumbs, any issues around here, really nice to loop it around fingers and then secure that around the wrist. The other types of strapping that you can have are what are called tear-like strappings. And this is an example of one of those really. So you can see it's much thinner, the thread count's much less, and there's much more give than there is on an EAB strapping. Now these are probably less adhesive, but they adhere to themselves, which is a massive advantage. The other thing you can often use is like a vet tape or a horse tape, which is also really nice to snug joints in place. But again, this is a really useful product. Don't apply it with tension. Is a bit of a learning point, because when it recoils, it will then potentially occlude sort of vascular neural tissue as you do that. But again, a lovely little strapping. Some footballers may only want something like this around ankles and things, so it's more a proprioceptive thing with a little bit of compression really, just so they don't feel like they're limited. The other thing that you will come across undoubtedly is something called Hyperfix. Now this is Hyperfix here. Now this is a really adhesive, sticky backed product, and what you use it for is almost like an underlay in preparation, usually for zinc oxide. So if I just cut a little bit just to show you, where you are here, the actual taping is underneath, so it's not sticky on either side, but what you need to do is expose the adhesive side of the strapping. So what you're going to do is almost separate the two bits here, so then the two bits of paper come apart, and then all you're going to do is just literally unravel that, and again do exactly the same on the other side. So then what we have is a sticky side and a totally unsticky side. on this. You can lay that onto an athlete, particularly if they're hairy. Really useful to, again, can adhere to itself. So you can create a circumferential anchor for a lot of tape to stick onto. So that's really useful. That is the 5 centimeter version, which again we'd use a lot for ankles, maybe little smaller joints. And then you've got the alternative, which is just the bigger 7.5 centimeter version really with this. So it's exactly the same. It has the option to separate the 2 bits of paper, which reveals that adhesive surface. And again, this would be ideal for anyone to sort of put over shoulders to create, again, a platform that you can put anchors on to then sort of stabilize things like instability, subluxations, any AC joint issues, things like that. Going on to more dynamic taping options, really. So you've got kinesio tape, K-tape, dynamic tape. They all predominantly do exactly the same thing, but they just come in different formats. So if I just sort of introduce that, really, you can get what we used, which was a huge roll of K-tape, and then we would just cut that to whatever size we wanted, and then we could potentially cut into it with round the edges just to make sure that it doesn't come unstuck. And again, exactly like the Hyperfix, it's got a paper layer underneath. And what you normally do is almost rip the paper underneath, so then you can apply the taping. Now what you're then going to do is almost try and avoid touching the back of this, because it's not very adhesive and loses that stickiness. And you're going to unravel that to the point where you can actually unpeel that, and then you can apply that with whatever degree, percentage-wise of strapping that you may want to apply to that athlete. Really useful to give a little bit of proprioceptive feedback, a little bit of assistance, and maybe as that athlete goes into maybe a more vulnerable soft tissue position, say like a hamstring, in that hip flex, knee extended position, ideally if you put that on stretch, then what's going to happen again, it's going to recoil slightly and give that athlete a little bit more proprioceptive feedback. Now, the products are predominantly the same, exactly the same as the other products down here. The more expensive, usually the better the thread count is. It depends on what you want to achieve. You can buy pre-cuts. Now, this limits you in some respects. So, little pre-cuts that you've got here. Again, some of them have then got an additional cut in there, so you may well be able to tear that. So for easy application, what you might decide to do is you almost put your anchor down, apply the stretch in this position, and then you can almost engulf a joint or a bit of soft tissue really to get a little bit more input. So that's your other option with those. You can buy them in all different types of packs. Again, it might be that athletes have presented to you and they said, I bought an ankle pack, can you just apply it? And it might be for an Achilles, for example, in this case. So here we've got the Achilles sort of K-tape pack, which again, everything's pre-cut. It's not bespoke to the athlete. So that's why I much prefer cutting my own. But unless you're going to use that in large amounts, it's probably not worth it. In terms of removing the strapping, once that's all applied and you've got it all locked in, what you may opt to use, which some people like, are, again, the bandage scissors that are here. The other thing is something called a shark, and what it is almost a blade. So almost what you do is put this layer of the blade against the athlete's skin and slide that up the line of the taping itself. That will beautifully cut through zinc oxide taping. It battles a little bit with this EAB, but generally that's the best way to take the strapping off if you want to do it quickly and effectively. Once it's off, what the athlete often complains about is if you've particularly used an adhesive glue or you've used a lot of zinc oxide onto the skin itself, is it feels a bit claggy and a bit sticky, and they struggle with shampoos to take that off in the shower. So little tips for you for that is either use something just like a massage cream to take that off. You can use something like a sort of hand sanitizer, is often quite useful, and again that helps to just remove any of that glue that's maybe adhesed onto the skin and is annoying that athlete. So that's it really. Hopefully that gives you a little bit of an idea of all the different products that you might come across in a sporting environment. It totally depends on what you are trying to achieve. If it's stability, zinc oxides are brilliant. It might be that you need to use something like a hyperfix underneath just to provide a better platform for that. You might want to reinforce that with something a bit more rigid like an EAB strapping. Or if you just want something lighter like a tear light, that's a lovely option as well. If you want something more dynamic that the athlete feels even less restricted with, particularly for soft tissue injuries rather than maybe the more joint related problems, your dynamic taping is probably the option to go for.
So there you go. So that's the majority of things that we look at. The little additional bits that may just be worth considering, which may give the athlete a little bit more protection if they've had an impact, or you want to just offer a little bit more support maybe around there, are using things like foams or felts. So it's normally a 7mm swan foam, it's called, and basically what you want to do with that is almost apply it over the area, maybe where there's been an impact or a contusion injury, that kind of thing. Now you can make that a little bit better again by almost creating like a donut. So almost cut out a shape, be it sort of a circle, for example, and then cut out a central circle in it. Now you can layer that foam one on top of the other, so you've then got an area where in the middle is maybe the injured or sort of bruised area, and then almost cover over the top of it with a sort of almost a top of foam, or maybe then some additional sort of taping just to hold it in place. Now you can go the next level up from there really and look at these gel pads that are there. So that bottom left hand side, those dermal pads, really useful to help dissipate some of the impact. Really useful again on sort of AC joints. It's got it using on the back of the hand there. I think it's quite cumbersome, to be honest, in there. The other thing that you can consider, again, is create your own thermoplastic splint. So you'd heat up the splint itself, then it becomes malleable and moldable into whatever shape you want it. Again, you may use the foam underneath to create a little almost sort of raised section in that thermoplastic, and then just apply it over the area. So dead legs, absolutely brilliant for those across the front of that thigh, which is potentially vulnerable to impact again. But if you've got something there, again, it needs to be approved by whatever governing body sport-wise you're using, or maybe just sort of cover it with some additional foam. So in terms of removal, so this is what I was just touching upon. So on the left-hand side there, you can see there's something called a clever cutter. That's almost like a bit of parcel removal device, really. So you basically use that to cut through bits of taping that were maybe on parcels, but it works perfectly for removing tape as well. That is pretty small. A little bit bigger, or with a handle built into it, really, is this sort of M cutter, or the shark, really, you can see on the bottom there, that black device, where really you can see it's got the teeth, and you're just gliding that up the line of where that tape is, and the blade will just slice straight through with very little to no risk of cutting the athlete, compared to trimming that off with scissors where you're going in blind. And then again, sort of removal wise, you've got your tape fix remover, so you can spray that on, and then it will hopefully take off the glues or the bits of adhesive that are left on there. You can use massage lotion, and I have been known to sort of have athletes who've used this WD-40, really, so it's almost something that takes off the layer of adhesive there. So on to the strapping techniques, really. What are we going to look at? So we're going to look at the inversion injury and also the syndesmosis, so that high ankle injury, and how we stabilize that distally around the sort of tibiofibular region. We'll look at the first MTPJ. We'll do a calf dynamic kinesio style taping. We'll look at the knee, so we'll give you an example of the MCL and how you can adapt that again for ACL and meniscal style injuries. We'll give you, again, a dynamic approach to a hamstring, and then look at the sort of patellofemoral and patellar tendinopathy taping options. So in terms of an inversion injury, really, I've just got a video here of one of our athletes who then ruptures his ATFL and CFL. So you can see that right foot, it goes over and over inverts, really. Because it's in neutral, that's probably why he did his CFL and ATFL. But again, any sort of either chronic issues like this are more than likely to have some instability in the future. Now, you can do various things with that. You obviously make sure that you go through all of a robust rehabilitation process with it. But again, when that athlete goes back again, even if you feel like you've restored all of that dynamic and static stability around that region, they may well benefit from some taping. So I'm just going to show you that, really. So you need your hyperfix, those rectangles that were cut, approximately 5 centimeters in size. use your zinc oxide, and then you may want to lock that in with your tail light. So this is a variety of different ways that you can look at taping an ankle. You're not going to use all of these, but this will give you a lot of food for thought.
So if we take you through an ankle strapping, there's a lot of different variations that you can use to try and give stability around the lateral aspect of that ankle, and we'll try and cover some of those now. Now, in terms of preparation, you always find that the athlete's got a fair bit of fluff or dirt and things on there. You may want to use a pre-tape spray, you may need to use an underwrap for this. It will vary depending on the severity of the injury in terms of which technique that you find most useful. Now, regardless of the technique, what I'd always use is something to try and prevent any sort of blisters occurring. So, majority of the compression from the tape will usually occur across the anterior aspect or at the back of that Achilles. So, if we allow that, just relax your foot slightly, just so the tendons of that tibia chill out. Apply the tape just over the front of that ankle. And then we're going to do exactly the same across the back. So, where the ankle tends to hinge, just at the base of that Achilles, we're just laying on the hyperfix, just because the zinc oxide may well cut into that a little bit during that. Now when you tape, what I do is just almost have them in a plantar grade position here, because obviously the mechanism of injury is usually into that inversion and plantar flex position, bringing in that ATFL. So put them in a neutral position. If they're really sore, what you may need to do is almost start them in some eversion in there. Now, zinc oxide's the predominant go-to with this. In terms of anchors, you may want to use something like Hyperfix, or you might want to use even like a tail light strapping and just apply it on. Just for ease here, what we'll do is almost apply an anchor now. Give yourself enough room, so the longer your stirrups are, the more pull that you'll have to work with. So apply that there. I normally tape just outer, so I can then allow the tape just to sit on there, so there's no tension onto that region. So same again, you'll always get a bit of an idea, let it fall, and then drop in here. So then you've got something for the tape to stick onto. Now you're going to go from a medial to a lateral angle. Start medially, sort of going over that medial malleolus or even slightly behind. Fix down. And then depending on the degree of injury and how much restriction you want to give, as you come up the lateral aspect, you can apply as much pull or just allow the tape to lay on there. So tear it off, stabilize it here, pin it down, and just make sure you stick it down so there's no creases. What you're going to do is just build that up. So give yourself 4 or 5 mil in between each one. And what you start to end up with is almost like a V formation. So you're gradually working your way inwards to give a little bit of stability. So these are what are deemed stirrups. And once you get to the middle, that's usually when I'm pretty happy. Now, you don't want to encroach too much into the sole of the foot, because as that drives into the foot, it can be quite sore if you've got a running athlete. Now, you've got various other different options in terms of building that up if the athlete wants them. They may say they want some 6s. If they want a 6, what I do is just start almost slightly anterior to that lateral malleolus, come across, go underneath the foot in the same angulation, and then you're just pulling up and across. Again, pin that down again. So just to show you that again, you're going to start almost slightly anterior, almost thinking about the location of that ATFL, come across, come underneath, again, not encroaching too high, and then pulling into a 6-shaped position. So that's a 6 if someone asks for 6s. The other thing that you can do is almost add an 8. So for this one, you're going to start much higher, come across the anterior aspect of the medial malleolus, coming across here, and then across the anterior aspect there. So you're actually creating a cross across the front of the joint. Just to show you that one again, so you're coming from a pretty high position, coming right across the anterior line there, and then coming around to then stabilise on that medial aspect. Now you can build up in addition some additional support around that lateral ligament complex. So for these ones, what you may want to do is just think about protecting certain structures. So you may want to put in some additional little strips in whichever angle, be it ATFL or CFL, that needs a little bit more stability in there. Again, these are variations. You don't need to do all of these. If you want to, you can obviously come in a little bit further down and build that angulation up that way. Again, you can build up as many as you want to with that. The next thing that is almost a given is making sure you apply a heel lock. So for your heel lock, start on the anterolateral aspect, come behind the medial malleolus, come in behind here, and then what you're doing is coming underneath across the front of the medial malleolus, tearing off and fixing in the same angle. So just to show you that again. Any little bits of tape that you muck up, just tear it off. Don't try and save it. Come in behind, up and under, and then you're finishing on the opposite side. Yeah. To show you that from the other angle, so you might want to start on the medial aspect this time. You're coming behind the lateral malleolus, round that calcaneus, and then up and across the front, or the anterior aspect of that lateral malleoli. Then what you might want to do is just lock that off, just to stop the little ends. So again, don't go circumferential. Build that up. Now the other thing that people might ask for is an anterior strip. So what that's doing is preventing the plantar flexion aspect of this. So what you might want to do then is go from a proximal perspective to distal and just lay on some additional anterior strips. So measure up. These can be quite restrictive. What you're going to do is apply that there and then just allow that to fall onto the athlete. Show you that again. Measure up. And then let it fall down. Often, if you're going to do these, you probably apply 3 across the front. And then again, just seal in the ends if they ask for it. Fix it all down, and then what you might need over the top is just something to support that. So, go-to is that tail-like strapping, and again, you're just going to lay that on. So take the tension out. It doesn't matter too much going across the front here. And you're just going to figure of 8 weave that. Finish medially. And then you may want to just stabilise that with a little bit of zinc oxide. So there are a wide variety of different techniques that you can use. You'd rarely use all of those. Pick and choose which ones are the most appropriate, and the athlete will guide you whether or not they're happy. It might be you try one, get them to go out running, see what they're like with a change of direction or running drills. If they like it, great. If they want some additional support, if there's too much support, just take off layers as you need.
So there you go, you can see that in sort of a 360-degree angle there. From there you can see how much space I've left just as we've gone up with those stirrups as well. The other little technique that may be of use to you for some people who maybe have had more of a pull rather than a actual pathological tear to the ligaments on that lateral ankle complex, sometimes what can happen is it just draws forward that lateral malleolus, so that distal part of the fibula, As the ankle rolls into inversion, you might find that actually it just glides that slightly anteriorly. Now, little easy corrective technique, if we think about your mulligan positional bits and pieces from there, you may apply a dynamic taping and almost apply that with an AP glide. So what you may need to do is pre-position the outer part of the lateral malleolus, almost apply a glide, and then use that wrap round with the kinesio tape to almost just reposition that. And sometimes if it's not a tear, but again, things feel like they've just pulled forward a bit, it may look slightly further forward compared to the other side. That's not a bad little strategy. And it might be you have to do that and then apply the taping, and that makes the athlete's biomechanics feel considerably better and less jammy into that anterolateral aspect of the ankle. And then if we sort of think about post-injury stuff, compressive taping can be an excellent resource, particularly in the acute phases. And what I'd use is this sort of horseshoe style technique. So I'd cut that out of foam. That will then just add some additional compression right around that lateral ankle complex. So you can see after you take that off, where the foam has been on the right hand side, you've got that shape of a horseshoe that's there. Now that will help to avoid any sort of neurovascular compromise, really, because it's just avoiding full compression. But you can just wrap around there with that similar figure-of-8 drill that we used before. Now that was your inversion injury. Now don't forget that there's also the high ankle or syndesmotic injury that you can also get. So if we have a look at the picture on the top right hand side there, particularly that AITFL is the one that normally becomes injured. Now it might also be accompanied by that interosseous membrane or some of the other ligamentous structures sitting around there. But basically the mechanism of injury is that sort of planted foot. You're then going into more dorsiflexion plus or minus some rotation. So you're basically jamming up that mortise and almost creating a splaying in that tibiofibular region. So if there is a tear there, clearly what we want to try and do is avoid the separation of that distal tib-fib joint. So here's a couple of little techniques that do that. Now, you can just apply a circumferential, almost like a strap technique around the level of that syndesmosis, which may well give that athlete some support. So just a slightly lower anchor, really, but then almost use a little fastening technique with that. Now, if I show you this is a basket weave, and I've used a couple of different physios that I work with, some great physios, but they've all got their own little techniques, but a lot of the principles are very similar. So you can see here what he's doing. He's just adding gradually layers of the stirrups onto that ankle. Exactly the same as we would have done previously. But then this is the additional bit. So you've got a basket weave. So you're basically going from almost the level of that fifth metatarsal round to the other side. Doesn't matter really if you go medial to lateral or lateral to medial. And then what he's doing is applying an ankle heel lock and then building up the basket weave from there. So you can see he's leaving the front of that ankle empty, so he's still got mobility into dorsiflexion and not jamming everything up. Now that might be enough. Now for this athlete, he's putting on some anterior strips that we saw before. So again, you're just going to layer them on. Usually you use 3 or maybe 4 strips across the front of that ankle. And what that's doing is just limiting the amount of plantar flexion that they have. So if we think about the ATFL, mostly injured in that plantar flex position. If they can't get all the way down there, then again, the anatomical risk is less. And then what he's doing is just using this taillight strapping to then apply a little bit of compression and lock in the whole ankle. And then just finishing that off with some zinc oxide. Now, if we look at the one on the right-hand side, slightly different. So he uses 2 anchors. It gives him more stability for the tape to stick onto, which is why he likes it. He's used bigger elements of that hyperfix to protect the foot. And what he's doing is going on a ratio of 2 basket weaves to 1 stirrup. So he's putting 1 basket weave on there, putting a second one on, and then what he's doing is adding the extra stirrup. Again, slightly different technique in terms of application. Absolutely nothing wrong with that. You'll adapt and come up with your own little ways that you prefer to do these. But what you can see is it's almost creating like a ski boot effect around that ankle. So lots of stability, lots of support, and actually very comfortable for the athlete. These ones are actually sometimes more comfortable, bizarrely, than adding just the multiple heel locks and things on there. And again, slightly different variations in terms of how to apply the wrap, but again, giving some great stability around there. Now, if we go on to sort of a more soft tissue injury, so if we take the calf, for example, so this kinesio style taping application, you can do this in lying on the left-hand side and apply it there, or you can apply it in a standing position as well and get the athlete to go into a almost knee-to-wall position where they're putting that calf on some additional stretch. I always think it's best to start in a dorsiflex position because that is typically where the calf becomes injured. The gastroc, if we imagine, into that terminal eccentric control into dorsiflexion, plus that knee extension, that is where the athlete is most likely to injure themselves. So what I'd almost do is put them into that range, and then the dynamic tape offers you some stability. So I'd just go from, for me, I always go underneath the calcaneus. I feel like being underneath the sock enables it to stick a little bit better and it doesn't ride up and it doesn't peel away. Some people just go from that insertion of the Achilles and up over. And it, depending on what you want to support, be it the medial aspect or the lateral aspect or both, you can apply the number of strips accordingly. This just shows me applying it in that sort of prone position. Again, highlighting that you want it in that dorsiflex position. You might have a foam roller under their foot, some towels, or your own leg underneath there to apply that. But again, you can see you put the K-tape on stretch. So therefore, what happens is it then gives some mechanical advantage and support to that calf itself. So when it goes into that end of range dorsiflexion position, there's increased tension on the tape. And then there's some increased sensory information into that calf itself. So then hopefully what you get is the muscle recruitment in that range. Now that can't replace a solid rehab program where you're strengthening into that terminal range, but it can offer a little bit of extra support. Now, if we go on to the MCL, really, so if we go on to the knee itself, clearly if you have a valgus stress, or which is often that sort of lateral knee impact that you have, plus or minus rotation, which may well drop in a little bit of meniscal irritation as well, what you'll get is some relative opening on the inside of that knee. Now, the MCL that sits there will become overstressed. And again, if you've got anything from like a grade 2 or above, you're more than likely to have some residual laxity that is there. Now, when the athlete returns, you may need to use some techniques that I'll show you here.
So if we run through an MCL strapping for an athlete here, what I'd start with is just something underneath the heel. So if you get the athlete just to lift the heel up and pop that down, just so they're out of full knee extension. So if we think about the MCL that we're going to try and support, it's fairly stable in an extended position, but then as we come out of that position, that's when we require the stability. So it makes sense to strap it in that position. So what I'm going to do is create 2 anchors, top and bottom, and then what I'm going to do is create a build-up of crosses over that MCL and then just run some vertical strips straight down from there. The anchors that you can use can vary. You could use EAB strapping, some taillight strapping, some Hyperfix. Just for ease of this, what I'm going to do is just apply the zinc oxide strapping here. So give yourself a good 6 inches above the knee to do it. Don't go all the way around circumferentially because you're just going to block off vascular tissue. So I normally use a couple of anchors above and then similar below. Go far enough so you've got something for the tape to stick onto and go from there. Now, I'd usually use something like an adhesive so the tape adheses a little bit better. But what I'm trying to do is almost anatomically cross over where that MCL is. So if we think the 2 condyles that are there, we're trying to go across there. So I'm going to start on the top. I'm going to run that all the way down and pin that distally. Seal it in, make sure there's no creases at all on any of the strapping. So for the next ones, what you can do is lay the strapping on. What I quite like to do is almost measure it up, just for ease. And then you can see exactly where you're laying that strapping. So once you've built up the cross, what you're going to do then is just lay some strips vertically through there. And then what I do is just seal all of that in. So you can see there we've got the cross and then the vertical strips. Depending on how much stability you need, depends on how many strips you're likely to use. And then what I do is just add either a taillight strapping or an EAB strapping if you want a little bit more stability. Start medially. Lay that on. Then once you've got a reasonable base layer, what you're doing is just guiding the tape directly over where that MCL is. Apply a pull and then just let it go back slightly and lay that on. Try if you can not to cross the back of the knee, which is a bit uncomfortable, and try not to encroach on that patella. And there you have an MCL strap-in. What I'd always do is just apply a little bit of zinc oxide taping just to the end, because that will undoubtedly unravel. Someone will catch the end of that tape, and then your beautiful tape job that you've done, it's that sad moment where you've got to redo it all, or it starts hanging off and looking like a dog's dinner. But that is an MCL strap-in, so you can see the crossover medially, and then obviously everything else is just locked in from there. You haven't encroached on the patellofemoral joint, and also you've left the back of the knee free, just so there's no crinkling of the tape that can occur in there.
So there you go. So then if we think about the patella, which is the natural next step really, then really you can have some variations in terms of where that patella is sitting. It might be something local, or actually there may be some big influences proximally and distally. But normally in the history, what the athlete doesn't like is sort of prolonged sitting, that sort of moviegoer's knee. It doesn't like compression, as the sort of facets that sit on the back of that knee compress into the structures behind. And then again, what we may need to do is just look at realigning the patella itself.
So when you think about the patellofemoral joint, you may want to have a little look locally at where that patella is sitting. Now, observation-wise, you may get this comparing one side to the other. So it may be sitting in between those condyles. It may be shifted laterally as the whole movement. It might be tilted laterally, or you may well get a rotational component on that patella. So what you can do is almost something local to try and correct the position, if you like. Now you can correct the position, and then I'll show you some little ways that you can almost activate that VMO, or even put a little bit of a lateral block on. So if you wanted to correct the position of the patella, what you may opt to do, again, get your K-tape, think about the position of this. So apply your K-tape just onto that patella. You may want to actually glide the patella medially if it's a lateral glide. Pick up the tension in the tape and then just lay that on. If for some reason you have a tilt, so rather than the patella sitting flat, you've almost got a little bit of an angulation there, what you can do is go onto half of the patella and then almost seesaw it back into position. So if we just show you that one. So rather than coming right to the outer side of the patella, what we can do is put it halfway on. Again, apply the tilt, so we're pushing down the medial aspect of that patella and then laying the tape on that way. So just to revisit that, so you've got either the whole glide across where you're coming from the outer side of that lateral patella, or you go halfway and add the tilt. Again, eyeball what's happening compared to the other side. Then what you may opt to do are either a VMO activation. So what you may do with this, if we get the athlete to lie down, measure up. So what you're doing is coming down the contour of that VMO and then almost coming underneath the patella to create a little cradle there. So apply that onto there, apply your stretch. So you're fixing up here and then almost just contouring that around the underside of that patella there. So with the stretch, ideally that is facilitating that VMO. Now, the other thing that you can add on there is almost a lateral block. So with this one, I'm going the opposite direction. So again, I'm just coming underneath the patella here. I'm applying that tape directly onto there. I may want to almost pre-position the patella, so it's almost glided slightly medially, and then almost find the outer portion or that border of the patella, and then almost apply your glide. Doesn't have to be with much stretch on there because that's just acting as a bit of a block. Again, seal that down. And then the other thing that you may opt to do, which is quite nice, is almost just put a little bit of a fixer underneath just to hold that patella with a little bit of support. You can use this for your patella tendon offloads as well. And again, retract your tape, apply it centrally, and then almost cradle underneath that patella. So you're applying your pull into that range there. Lay the tape on, and that will just give you, again, a nice bit of stability around that patella there. So all of it can be potentially sealed in addition if you want it to, but then again, you've corrected the patella position, you've done your VMO strip to give that a little bit of pre-activation, and then you've also got your lateral strip, which is almost a bit of a blocker to stop that patella moving laterally.
So then again, if we stick with the K-tape side of things, really, you may have a hamstring that feels tight. Again, you need to be looking at all of your objective markers, your sit and reach, your toe touches, your straight leg raises. What is the contributing factor to that tightness, and address it. But if you have done that and you just want to offer a little bit of additional feedback into that hamstring, to give it a little bit of sort of sensory input really and facilitate that contraction, maybe into that sort of vulnerable position of sort of hip flexion, knee extension, it will just tighten up a little bit. So in terms of sort of the application of this really, I'll take you through that now.
So this is the application of kinesio or dynamic tape into a hamstring to try and provide a little bit more assistance, neuromuscular facilitation, and a little bit of proprioceptive feedback if they've come back from a tightness or post-injury and you want to support that hamstring a little bit more. So the way that you would do it is you take your kinesio tape. I like doing my own cuts, so I've got some pre-cuts that are done here. So we've just rounded off the edges to prevent any sort of catching on the edge of the tape, which might cause it to come off. And then what we're looking at doing is applying the K-tape from the ischial tuberosity, either medially for your semitendinosus, more your membranosus, or slightly laterally more towards that fibular head for your biceps femoris. The majority that we tend to do are from that ischial tuberosity out over to that biceps femoris, with it being the more common injury that we tend to see. Now, the position of the athlete, we're going to get them to hang one leg off the side of the bed. So if we think about the injury position that we generally find with a hamstring, it's in that hip flexed, knee extended position as that hamstring eccentrically controls that knee extension. So we're trying to mimic that same position here, so we've got that athlete already pre-tensioned in that position. You might want to use some adhesive spray just to give a little bit more tactile adhesion for the tape, particularly if it's rainy, they're sweaty, or they're a hairy athlete. And what you're looking at doing, as you would do with any K-tape, is almost take the end off. So you're going to rip the tape, you're going to find that ischial tuberosity, you're going to lay the tape on without any sort of form of stretch and apply a pressure to enable that K-tape to adhere. And then what you're doing is rolling back the backing of the tape, applying a stretch as much as you want, from 25 to say 50% stretch, all the way down, and applying that tape in the angulation that helps to follow the line of the muscle contour. Now, I like using 3. It might depend on the size of your athlete, how many you use, but what you're going to do is almost overlap the tape by, say, 25 to 50%, depending on how many you want to apply. Same thing, the initial stage is just laid on, and then we're just applying that tape with tension, and then taking the tape off as we apply that distally. You can use the back of the tape to enable that to adhere slightly better. And again, an optional third strip if you feel like you need it. And again, overlapping about 50% there. Apply your tape in that the stretch in the mid portion, and then let that roll down. So you can see what we've done here. We've gone from almost that ischial tuberosity, applied it in the angulation of the biceps femoris down towards that fibula head. Tried not to cross the knee joint just because that tends to loosen off the taping. You may want to reinforce that with a little bit of either hyperfix or a wrap, but that is in essence your kinesiodynamic taping application. That way, and almost go into that running stride position where they're injured. So you can see here what we have is the K-tape. Because it's pre-tensioned, it will give you a little bit more proprioceptive input and assistance in that position, because as the K-tape stretches, it will recoil and offer you a little bit of support.
So then if we go into a knee hyperextension injury, so when we hyperextend, there may well be some meniscal tears, compressions, pinches that may occur. And again, what we may want to do is just give that athlete a little bit of extra layer of support, really, just to limit or decelerate into that terminal extension position. So this is the taping strategy to prevent sort of hyperextension.
So you may have an athlete who's injured their meniscus. It might be a hyperextension injury. They might not like that end terminal range because it starts to pinch onto those structures. So to try and just limit the amount of hyperextension that there is there, what you may want to apply some K-tape just to prevent that overextension. So what I get is 4 strips usually of the K-tape in here, round the ends as you would do. To measure it, I normally go from the condyle of the femur all the way down to that sort of tibial condyle on the other side, because you're going to add a little bit more stretch in there. So what I do is take the end off. You're going to start them in some slight flexion to start with, and then they're going to go into active extension as you apply the tape. When we take the K-tape, we obviously take the end off, and then what we're looking at doing is just pulling back that level there. So in terms of application, so come round the back. Again, we're starting slightly on that anterolateral surface, and then what we're trying to do is cross the middle of that knee joint. So what I do is just peel the backing of the K-tape off in that position, and then once you get round to that midline, get that athlete to extend, apply the tension, and then just allow that just to sit onto the outer surface of that tibia. We're going to do exactly the same thing, just slightly overlap. So you're going to follow maybe about ½ centimetre down. Again, pull the tape back, fix there. As you come back and round, get the athlete to extend, and then come all the way around onto the outer part of that tibia, maybe slightly onto that fibula. So they're the lateral across the back of the joints. Now if we look at doing exactly the same thing from the medial aspect. So similar distance. So apply the tape, keep it fixed on, retract your backing, come across the middle there, make sure you miss that patella, and apply that. Again, overlap by about ½ centimetre, come all the way around, get the athlete to extend. Now normally that alone will stay. If you want additional support with that, then what you can do is just lock off the ends really. Obviously if it's wet or you're in a contact sport, the chances are that the ends may well get touched. You've rounded them anyway, but if you want an additional layer, because it is sad if it does come off after you've done a nice tape job, pull out the tension, let it come back again, and just circumferentially go around that quad. I always lock off medially, just because of the fact that it's less vulnerable, and you may want to do exactly the same further down. So there you go. So that will hopefully help prevent that hyperextension of that knee.
So then if we jump onto a patellar tendinopathy style strapping, so if the athlete has often had a history of tendon overload, really, we know it doesn't like spikes in various different components, speed, plyometrics, jumping, sprint meters, whatever it may be. And what you're trying to do with this taping is obviously then create like an offload for that patellar tendon or like a new anchor point for that, really. And I'll show you this now.
So you might have athletes who have tendinopathy issues around that patella. So thinking about the anatomy, obviously as it runs from that distal pole of your patella into that tibial tuberosity, what you may find useful with an athlete is to try and almost anchor it slightly halfway between. So rather than the pull occurring into the tibial tuberosity and it tractioning and starting to get that soreness, if we almost reduce the length of that tendon artificially, then it might help offload some of their symptoms. So what we do with this, again, we're using like an EAB strapping. Try not to apply it on stretch, because when it then recoils, you may end up with some neurovascular compromise there. So find the distal pole of the patella, find the tibial tuberosity, come in between. And what I'm doing is just laying the tape on. So I'm pulling it out and then just coming round from there. Now, when I get back to the middle again, what I often find useful is to create an anchor, is stabilize it with your thumb and apply a full twist. Then what you're going to do is almost push that twist into the athlete. Come back round again, exactly the same thing. So if I show you, apply the fix just about an inch or a centimetre to the lateral aspect, rotate the tape, so it's starting to build up a little almost knot device there, and then come back round again. Exactly the same thing. So no tension, apply the twist, move on to the knot, and come back round again. Now 3 times is the usual in terms of how many. And then this last one, there's no tension here, and then I actually apply it with quite a bit of tension across the front of that patella. And then what we're doing is just looking at almost rip that off and stabilize it. So that will give the athlete a little bit of support here. You may or may not want to use something like a tear-like strapping over the top just to hold it in place. So to do that, again, all this is just to try and avoid it coming off. So there's no tension on there. Fix it medially and stabilizes. So you've moved the insertion of that patellar tendon artificially to slightly more proximal, so there's less pull and drag onto that tibial tuberosity.
So then if we have a little look into the foot itself, just to finish with, so if we think about that first MTPJ really, and what happens in that normal windlass mechanism where we get some extension and then that propulsion off that first MTPJ, clearly there's a lot of elastic energy that can be stored in there. Now what can happen are one of 2 things really. You can either have hypermobility there, so maybe in a sort of turf tape scenario it's sore to actually bend from that joint. Now, in that sort of situation, we may be looking at really stabilizing the joint, so then it's less painful and we restore some load through that region. Clearly, by doing that, we block off a little bit of that mobility. And the contrast to that is maybe with more your sort of bunion formations and things, it may be sort of veering off a little bit, so you can't recruit from that joint either. So your push off is then reduced. And what you may want to do is increase that push off. So you may need to work on the alignment that's there. So that is just the technique that I'm going to show you here with the K-tape. So what I'm doing here is more that alignment based work. So I'm pulling the toe from that almost sort of bunion-esque position where it's coming in over, and then applying the glide from the inner part of that toe to the outer part. Now, if they want some additional support, again, across the base of that foot, when they go into hyperextension, it's often a little bit sort of painful. So then again, what we're doing is just putting a couple of layers on, and then you can see that it's drawing the toe into a more anatomically advantageous position. And then all I've done is just lock that in really. from there. So then the athlete, hopefully, from that position, will feel a little bit more able to recruit through that joint. Now, the opposite to that is that we stabilize and block off all the movement there. So I put an anchor on either around that distal phalanx or that proximal phalanx of the toe. And then what I'm doing is just building up more rigid layers of taping using the zinc oxide. So again, you can put the base strips on first of all, and then work into the lateral aspect there. And you can add that additional stretch to pull it into alignment after that. And then all I've done really is, as I sort of shown there, it's limiting that hyperextension and it's offering stability. And then I've just used Hyperfix to hold that all together. So particularly with your scrummagers in rugby or people who are, again, reluctant to sort of push off from there with a sort of turf toe scenario, that's more of a rigid version. So that's it really. In summary, really, what we've gone through are the materials and some of the adjuncts that we use in professional sport to help with sort of taping and protection of joints. We've talked about the preparation side of things, so making sure that you put in some time before the athletes actually come to do your pre-cuts and get everything ready. Anatomy and injury mechanisms are key for this, so we need to almost think about that, and then we can apply these principles to a wide range of different conditions. Now, this is obviously not all the strapping techniques you can do. There are various additional ones on the website that you can have a little look at, but using these principles, you should be able to apply that accordingly. And that will vary depending on whether you're wanting to provide joint stability versus maybe a more dynamic taping option. But again, we need to be thinking about the wider influencing factors with all of these athletes. Why do they need taping? What is the underpinning reason? Have we addressed enough in rehabilitation? Have we got proprioception good enough? Is there control neuromuscularly in the correct ranges to allow that athlete to have that reduced injury prevention element and also that recruitment strategy? But well done. Congratulations. That is the lower limb taping complete. If you haven't already done the upper limb taping techniques course, you should do. And then on the website, again, there's the injury prevention module, which again sort of supplements a lot of this. Okay, folks, there you go. So I'll just cut it off there. And then if anyone has any questions, anything that you want me to clarify a little bit more, anything that you want me to kind of explain, then I'll do that. Quite happily. But yeah, if you want to drop anything into the chat box, that would be grand. And I'll just have a little look in there to see if there's anything in there that has come through already. Grand. Don't think there is. I think we're overrunning a little bit time-wise as well. But yeah, the whole thing is recorded. So if people do need to run off and jump away, then yeah, I'll ping all of that through for you. Has anyone got any questions that you want to fire at me? Because I'm very happy to answer anything that isn't explained necessarily. Nothing coming through at the moment. Someone just asked, is there a certificate yet? So you might have missed the beginning. So the whole thing is recorded. I'll send you the recording, send you the certificates through. And there's also, it's going to be now, Samantha, for the upper limb session now. So yeah, that will just continue straight on after this on the same session. But yeah, I'll send all of that kind of stuff through for you all, because I know that when you are learning to tape, what you'll probably end up doing is applying some tape in, rewinding it a little bit, applying a few more layers, and then just kind of checking angles and jangles and things from there, really. And then if people missed it, I'll just put in, there is going to be an option of a actual practical taping course if people do want to jump on Saturday the 9th of November in our National Training Centre for Excellence for Judo across in Birmingham. So if you do want to do that, then please do. Now, I know it's getting late, so what I'll do is there isn't any questions really that have come through. If there are, then I'll start it off and then you can kind of fly in. The second one's nowhere near as long, guys. So we're basically going to go through shoulders, elbows, wrists, hands, and then sort of the TFCC in and around there as well. But what I'll do is I'll share that and then catch you guys again in a little bit. Okay, hi everybody. Well, impact does. So let's record all of this. position to offer that stability. What will you need? Well, you'll need your Hyperfix, your zinc oxide, your taillight or an EAB strapping, and then your scissors. So this is how you maybe do your shoulder instability support work. Now, I've done this with the athlete just with a relaxed arm. We'll talk about the different positions that you may well pre-position them in after the video.
So this is a typical strapping that we maybe do for subluxation or someone who's coming back after a dislocation and maybe a recon on this. So what we normally use is the Hyperfix initially to try and just create an anchor. So running from anterior to posterior, put a couple of strips on there just so we've got something for that zinc oxide to adhere to. So the way that I would do it is just in terms of measuring, if you start just above sort of nipple line really, give yourself an inch, and then almost sort of similar distance at the back to the base of that scap. You don't really want to go beyond the scap, otherwise you're going to start to limit that shoulder range of motion wise. So if you cut that, as a little tip, what you might decide to do is almost lay it down and then just, instead of measuring it every single time, is just then almost go in and then cut your strips accordingly. So I would cut 4 strips. What you may opt to use is a adhesive spray, so something like a pre-tape spray, just so that it's a little bit more tactile. Again, just re-measure to make sure you've got the right length. And then what you're going to do is peel off Hyperfix, hold it at either end. This is just going to be laid on, so don't lay it on with any sort of tension. Pop it down and then pull it so that it's flat. Exactly the same with the next strip. All you're going to do is just slightly overlap it. Make sure you're not crossing that sort of auxiliary line. Come back from there. Next option is to go over with the zinc oxide taping. So you're going to lay that on, hold down to anchor, and then pull back over through here. So you're going to come straight over the top of that AC joint, pulling that down. And again, just go into the point where you're not crossing that auxiliary line there. You can do one of two things. You can just put a zinc anchor down here. If you want to, you can use the Hyperfix again, which will give you a little bit more stability, or you could use something like a taillight strapping, just so you've got something for that to adhere onto. If we use a taillight strapping, what you want to get the athlete to do is just tense that bicep, and then you're just going to lay that on around that mid bicep, sort of end of deltoid attachment wise. And then what I'd always do, just because it sticks a little bit better, is then add an extra little layer of the Tiger Tan tape, so you've got something for it to adhere to. Now, what I tend to do is always start posteriorly and lay the tape on, and conversely, anteriorly, add the pull, so you're actually relocating or providing stability anteriorly, which is where most shoulders tend to come out from. So what I do is just start on the anterior aspect. You're almost following the contour of the deltoid. And again, what you're doing is just going round almost to the back of that posterior acromion and just laying that taping on. You're going to build that up. Give yourself 0.5 centimetre between each layer. And depending on how much stability the athlete wants, you can make that narrower or wider accordingly. What you don't really want to do is go beyond the level of where that axilla is. And then you're going to do exactly the same thing across the front. So find the acromion, start anteriorly, you're coming across almost horizontal in there and just crossing over at the back. Again, you're going to build that up layer on layer. So there you can see that what I've done is go down to the layer where that sort of pec fold into that axilla is. I don't really want to go much lower than that because it will be too restrictive, particularly for overhead athletes. If this is an athlete who is a frequent subluxer, then what you may want to do is just reinforce that, potentially look at narrowing the distance between each one of those layers. So rather than leaving, say, 0.5 centimetre between each one, you may want to go to sort of 1/4 centimetre or put some additional support in there. What I just do then is just lock everything off. And then what I do is potentially just add an extra strip to seal in the ends. And there you have it. And then what I do is just layer your next hyperfix over the top. So that will hopefully give you a bit of stability. It will prevent that humerus translating anteriorly, which is where that typical dislocation or subluxing mechanism occurs. So the other consideration that you might have is that an athlete may, if they are doing a lot of overhead work, be really restricted by the anterior strips of this strapping. So what you may do, so we've got an ice hockey player here, if he goes into his position that he needs to go into in terms of that external rotation position, what you might find is that all of the tape starts to lift off. Now what you may want to do is just get them to go into the range that they need to functionally. That will loosen this, and then almost allow this to come up and then re-secure that back down again.
So you can just see that in sort of 180 degrees really there. Now the other thing that you can do with that is if you pre-position the athlete, which we'll talk about in a second, or maybe even once you pre-position them and they've taken the tape off, you then use little squares of hyperfix just to seal all of that down. So these are the two other alternatives in terms of the positions that you may well strap them in. The one on the left hand side is the one which we would typically use. You just get the athlete to put one of their hands on their hips that you're strapping. It changes the rotation that they have at that joint. It puts them in a little bit more abduction, so then when they are lifting overhead again, they feel like they've got a little bit more range and are a bit less restricted. If they still feel restricted, what you can actually do is tape them more towards that sort of end range position. The disadvantage of that is that they are almost sort of preloaded with the tape on, but you can go a lot heavier with the tape in and almost apply that. So you may want to support the athlete with their arm onto a bench, or if you're working behind them and they're sitting on the bench themselves, what you can do is almost just go into a stride position and support their arm in abduction using your own thigh, and then sort of take them in that position really. Again, they're variations. Different athletes will like different things, and you'll get to know that. Don't be afraid to sort of change what you're doing if the athlete feels a little bit restricted or a little bit unsupported. So then if we go into the sort of AC joint work really, so mechanism wise is generally the sort of impact, so to the anterior aspect of that shoulder, particularly tackles that come flying in. It may be a fall onto an outstretched hand, or it may be, in fact, like I did my AC joint, sort of lower level grade wise, almost being tackled in football, going up in the air and coming down and landing, almost in a mini somersault position, and the impact crunching into that AC joint. Now I reached for the ball because I knew it was going to be a free kick to us, and then I think probably with that arm outstretched plus the impact then led to that sort of AC joint problem. What do we want to do? Well, sometimes it sits a little bit higher, so you can see on the picture on the bottom there, the AC joint, or that clavicle, that sort of lateral aspect of the clavicle, can sit slightly higher, so there's a disruption in the ligament stability. So what you may want to do is actually pin it down. It can also be a useful technique if you try and lift up the rest of the shoulder, just to take a little bit of the traction or the weight out of that arm. So I'm going to show you two different techniques. I'm going to show you a sort of star technique with the sort of dynamic taping, and then also just have a little think about a more rigid strapping. So this is the more rigid version that most people are fairly familiar with. So they often call it an Adidas strapping, and that's just because sometimes there's three strips, like the three stripes in Adidas, of almost lifting up the arm. So again, you do this with your hand on your hip in that sort of slightly abducted internal rotation position. And then almost in that position, put your anchors on around that mid biceps, and you're applying a traction up over. So you're lifting up and taking the weight out of that arm. And then you're applying that onto an anchor that is over that sort of mid, almost trap region, or even with that sort of pinned down AC joint. So that strapping you just saw previously, the initial anchors plus those strips that are going from anterior to posterior, you can really pin down that AC joint to try and give it a little bit of stability. Now, the picture on the right-hand side is a technique that I've seen done on taping courses that you may see. I don't really see the point in it. What the idea of it is to almost go from an anchor around that shoulder underneath the elbow and then almost loop underneath. So you create almost a sling. So you're again pulling up into that shoulder, taking the weight out the arm. I don't see that being any more beneficial than supporting that arm on a table. And then what you can see is happening is they're then going around the mid bicep to anchor it off and then cutting. However, you then just lose the tape, so you just end up binning the rest of the tape. I think if you pin your anchor down mid bicep and pull up, it's ample. Now, I want to show you just the dynamic equivalent of an AC joint. So you can have disruption of the AC joint, but you can also have just a local capsular irritation. And I think this works beautifully for those ones, or maybe those lower grade injuries that you have. But you need to know how to cut the K-tape. So the main two cuts that I use are the V cut or the I cut. Now, it's all I cuts in this scenario, so you're just making the cut depending on the length that you want to achieve. Don't forget that your dynamic tapes stretch, and they can stretch up to about 50% length. So do allow for that extra bit of give in the system, but you're going to cut your strip and just round off the edges. This is what you need. So you'll need your 3 strips that you almost put over the star. They're about 10 centimeters. You're going to need your 3 strips for your sort of Adidas strapping. A little bit longer often, because you're going to go from that mid trap almost down into that sort of mid biceps region, sort of base of deltoid insertion. And then you may opt for some postural or upper trap strips as well, plus an anchor. So this is it.
So we'll go through the AC joint strapping using kinesio tape. Now, what happens typically with an AC joint is if you have disruption of the ligaments that surround that AC joint, is what you can sometimes find is there's a slight step deformity in there. This athlete's actually had an AC joint problem on the right, so you may see that it's subtly just sitting a little bit higher. What that looks like here is on there, you can see as it disrupts, what you end up with is an elevation or a migration upwards of that AC joint. So what you might want to do is pin it back down again. So what you do is get your K-tape. We'll show you a little star technique to start with. So you're peeling the K-tape back, locating the AC joint at the end of that acromion, coming on there and pinning down. So you're adding a little bit of pressure on the middle 2/3 and then allowing that just to lie flat. You can do exactly the same thing on the next application, but you're going to just go at a slightly different angle. Again, apply the pull down. And exactly the same with your 3rd strip. So you've covered the whole AC joint there. The other thing that AC joints don't typically like is traction down over. So traction, any push activities, you normally find that that's quite sore. So what you can do is look at applying some K-tape to help with elevation of that. So what I might get the athlete to do is just support their own elbow on that side. So you're taking out your upper traps a little bit. And then what I'm doing is I'm starting at that sort of just below deltoid territory there, allowing the tape to sit. Apply that, hold on to it so it doesn't go anywhere, apply your pull, seal that down, and then take the tension out from there. I like to use 3 strips with this. So the next strip, I'm going from the anterior aspect, again, going over that AC joint, picking up the tension, apply the tape, and then let it fall on. Similarly, exactly the same thing with that third strip. So again, pin down, apply your pull, seal it down, then take out the tension at the top. So you've got your star technique here, 3 strips at different angles, then you've got your 3 strips that are lifting that up. And then what I often like to apply is something just over the top as a bit of a postural improvement strategy. So when I apply this, I'm just applying the first strip to the front of that shoulder, just below the level of that AC joint. I like to pick up the trap. Often with AC joints, what you find is that the upper traps are very overactive. So it's quite nice to take out the tension. So I'm just lifting that up, creating a puckering of the skin, and then just allowing that just to fall onto the back of that scap. Pin that in. You can build that up across if you want to. And the other thing that often is quite nice, just as a bit of a postural reminder, is applying a strip just to the front of that shoulder. Pin it down, and then almost get the athlete just to pull their shoulder blades together a little bit. Don't engage that upper trap, and then pin that in there. So that's your AC joint strapping. So you've got your star, you've got your 3 strips that come up, and you've got your postural corrector, that trap offload, and then your last strip, what I do is just use this just to seal everything in really. So around that shoulder, get them to tighten the bicep, not going circumferentially, and that just helps hold everything in place.
So there you go, lots of different components of that strapping you can use for various different parts. It doesn't have to be for an AC joint. For example, something else that you could use this for would be something like an offload almost of that brachial plexus. So often if they have neural irritation, what happens is they don't like when they come in the weight of their arm. They often find that they like it in a pocket of a coat, and they don't like anything traction wise, like lifting shopping bags, anything like that at all. So these sort of strapping techniques you can extrapolate to then some neural offload bits, and these are really useful with a lot of my thoracic outlet patients as well. So then if we move on to the elbow, and we imagine that the athlete has maybe had a hyperextension or a valgus stress, they will irritate their sort of UCL and maybe that ulnar nerve getting trapped in between those bony prominences at the back of that elbow. So what do we want to try and do? So we want to obviously avoid that injury mechanism. So we're limiting extension and valgus stress onto that medial aspect of the elbow. Now you want to pre-position the elbow in a position that is going to be supportive. Now, clearly, if you strap that at 90 degrees, they may functionally be totally unable to perform any of the demands of their sport. So it might be that you need to almost come just out of extension and apply this technique. You can do it standing, you can do it supported on a chair, whatever is more comfortable or the preference for you and that athlete. And then if we just go into the technique really, so I'll show you how that can be applied.
So for this strapping, what we're going to look at is almost imagining that this athlete has had a hyperextension injury or has had a almost valgus stress through here, so that UCL has become affected. Often when we hyperextend, you get some extension of that ligament and potentially some tears. There's little bits of instability which generally tend to persevere for a little bit longer. So what we do, you can again use whatever form of anchor that you want to use. If we just for ease use zinc oxide. So again, we're going to create a platform for the taping to stick to. Probably looking at around sort of mid biceps region, and then a sort of similar distance really distally. The further apart they are, obviously the more tape that you have to work with. And then what we're going to ideally do, if we think about the anatomy, is almost lay strips across here. What we're looking at doing is almost crisscrossing our way along just to provide a little bit more stability to the athlete. So, fix your zinc oxide, put the tape, and then apply with a little bit of tension. Give yourself 0.5 centimetre between each strip. So that's one direction. For the next direction, what I generally do is measure up. So you've got the right distance, tear the tape, and then again, you're looking at laying that on to create a crisscross, roughly where that anatomical landmark is. Once you've got the cross, what you're then going to do is just build up the layers from that medial aspect of the elbow all the way over as far as you feel that athlete needs. The more anterior you come, the more limiting the strips will be into that extended position. The more strips you put laterally will prevent that opening up of that elbow. Same thing, so measure up. Think about how much pull you want to put on this. Lay that on. So it might be, if it's just the valgus stress that you're trying to prevent, that might be enough, or you can just build that up as far as you like it over the anterior aspect, or even just apply some anterior strips directly over here to provide a bit of stability. Again, once you've got to there, just lock in all the ends. And then take your tail light strap in, and what you're using this for is just to go over that region. So start medially, going laterally, and again just layer that tape on. And then when you get to the elbow joint itself, you're going to cross over in a figure of 8 formation. Pull the tape so you're not applying it with stretch, and then let it recoil. Then you're going across the joint itself. And there you go. So what you're doing, you've got the under strips that are preventing the opening up, the anterior strips that are providing stability. You've got the elbow in slight flexion to start with, just so it's not already locked in that position. The more flexion you strap the athlete in, clearly the more limitation towards extension you're going to have. And then you're just reinforcing that with a tail light or an EAB strapping if you wanted something a bit more stable.
So there you go. So just a couple of little points on that really is when you apply that black sort of tail light strapping, again, when you're applying it, unravel it as far as it'll go, almost within region, and then almost allow that to drop onto the athlete. Don't apply it just wrapping straight off the tape. As you go along, you may need to just maneuver the angles. You may need to just seal down to make sure there's no creases. And then also just using the back of your hand just to sort of allow that adhesion onto the athlete. Now, if we go on to the wrist itself, so clearly if you land on, again, like an outstretched hand, or you get forced into extension or flexion, you may well irritate some of the structures around that wrist. Now, the bias of this next test is just onto that TFCC. Now, if you're familiar with that, it's a little bit of cartilage that's sort of triangular in shape that sits on the outer or ulnar aspect of that wrist, and what can happen is you can get tears in it, you can get compression of it, particularly if they're forced into ulnar deviation plus extension. Now, what can happen on the back of that is if you've got a significant tear, what you actually end up with is what's called almost like this piano keying formation. So the ulnar styloid becomes a little bit more prominent. Now, that's usually a pretty big indicator to us that there is significant instability in the outside of that wrist, and therefore it is more than likely going to need some form of surgical opinion, if not then progressing onto surgery, really. But until that happens, we may well need to do things, and we can allow that athlete still to function by almost avoiding that irritable position and providing a bit of stability onto that aspect of the wrist. So when we strap it, normally I do it in neutral for a typical wrist strain, but if you are strapping with bias onto that TFCC, put them in a little fraction of flexion and then almost take them out of that ulnar deviated position into that radial deviation. There's a crisscross formation as you've sort of seen on other strategies, and again the use of sort of hyperfixed zinc oxide and tear light for this strapping. So I'll show you this one.
So you might have an athlete who has injured their wrist during an extension or landing on an outstretched hand, overextending, or even sort of going the other way. Now what you might need to do is stabilize this joint here, and what you could do is just apply a wrap. The technique that I'm going to show you is going to be more for the TFCC, so that triangular fibre cartilage tear that you have on this side. So what you might find is that there's an elevation, or almost like a piano keying, of that distal ulnar styloid on there. So what we want to do is apply, again, the anchors as usual. So again, making sure we're not going circumferential. We're leaving a tiny little gap on one side. So we're actually going over the top of that ulnar. Make sure we don't cross the actual wrist joint so they can still allow a little bit of movement. And then what we're doing is we're just going to drop into the hand region. Now, athletes won't like anything if they are, anyone who's using their hands to have anything across the palmar aspect. So what I do is almost just come distal to the carpo-metacarpal joints here and apply your anchor there. So just finishing it on the outer side of that hand. So try not to come into the palm region at all. And then what we're going to do is just apply strips. One straight, one angled this way, and then another one over that way. So we'll just build that up. Again, measure it using both anchors. So you're going to go from one anchor to the other. You might want to start the athlete in slight radial deviation and slight flexion there. So sometimes if they aren't holding their own hand, you might want to put something underneath there and allow them just to let it be supported on a table. So we're just crisscrossing over, starting central, and then just working our way across. So you just come onto that lateral aspect of the arm there. You can see crisscross strips, you can build them up. If you need some additional support with that, what you can do again to support that lateral aspect where the ulnar is almost build up the strips from a lateral to medial perspective there. Again, it depends on how much support you need. Sometimes with these chronic TFCC tears, what you may need to do is just keep on supporting that. Then what I do is just get something to hold it all together. So hold your tape, think about the direction that you're going to try and go in. So anatomically, we want it to radially deviate and come into slight flexion there. So that's the way that we're going to roll. So what I do, start laterally in here, pull the tape off as usual so we're not applying it with any tension, and just slowly build that up. As you come into the back of the hand there, what you may need to do is just angle back down again so you don't come into that palm. And then the other thing some athletes like is for it to come actually all the way over into that thumb region. So what you may need to do is just apply a small little cut. So fold your tape over, that'll make a little hole. And then what you can do is just slot the athlete's thumb into that region there. And then that allows you to come back round again. And then just seal it off with a little bit of zinc oxide strapping. So there you go. So what that's doing, it is preventing too much ulnar deviation. So it's limiting that movement there, and it's also limiting the amount of extension that you have as well.
There you go. So the last little bits of areas regarding the hand. So if we look at the thumb to start with, these hyperextension injuries, maybe it's abducted, and then therefore you've again just created an injury to that ulnar collateral ligament of the thumb region. In terms of pre-positioning for this taping strategy, I think almost getting the athlete to mimic the hand shaking position. So get them to put their hand almost into a neutral position so they're there rather than anything sort of too far in or too far out.
Typical injuries that you may find around the thumb are extension or abduction that you'd find with goalkeepers, rugby players, really common as that thumb gets forced into extension and abduction. So what you may want to do is just prevent that motion. So you're going to apply a strapping to prevent that. Now, I'm just going to show you this with an EAB strapping. What you may want to do beforehand is almost reinforce that with a zinc oxide, just so you're laying strips from an anchor here to here and just layering them down there. It's quite restrictive, so I'm just going to show you what it's like with an EAB strapping. So you're going to start laterally here around the wrist, and you're going to just lay the tape on until you've got a reasonable anchor. And then what you're doing is just looping that tape around that thenar eminence, around the joint, and then applying as much tension as you think that that athlete requires to give them stability. The other way to do it is to put that thumb in a little bit, so then they're already in a shortened position. I tend to do it just in a slightly off neutral position. And then what you're doing is just winding that up. If you have a little look at the tape, what I'm doing is allowing sort of 2 or 3 millimeters between each layer. You can see they're exactly the same sort of distance there. So I'm just building that up bit by bit. Again, once you've gone around 3 or 4 times, you can see the gradual layering that's occurring here, and then all I'm going to do is just lock that off. So just lay the tape on, apply that there. You might want to fix that with a little bit of zinc oxide. And what that's doing is then just preventing that overly extending in this direction. Again, depending on how severe the injury is, you may want to strap it in a slightly inward position, just so it's out of that stretch.
Okay, so then last little stage is really going into your fingers. So your fingers are more than likely to become affected, obviously, if you get any sort of valgus stress, any, again, hyperextensions, any rotational stresses that overload the ligament tissue around there. So collateral is typically affected. And what we may opt to do in the top picture is almost just stabilize each separate sort of interpharyngeal joint with some of those sort of collateral strips, really. So you may need to pre-do this, and you're just going to go crisscrossing across each joint, again in almost like a figure of 8 fashion, to give that individual joint a bit of stability. And then what you may need to do for the more irritable ones is then add on the body strapping. So therefore what you're doing is you're almost slot something in between the fingers if needs be. To be honest, in a sporting world, people, whatever you put in between their fingers will come out. So when they're playing, again, just body it onto the adjacent phalanx that's next to it. So what you will ideally get then is almost a little bit of an anchor. So then if you do get exposed to some of those stresses, it doesn't irritate the tissue. Now, you can also use something called Coban, which is this sort of compression or sort of veterinary tape that sometimes is used, again, to apply compression before you have applied some of that body strapping. But then if you do get a knock, it just, again, ideally with the body strapping on, prevents any of that stress. Now, fingers are typically quite unforgiving, and it's always worth, if you have any significant injury there that may indicate that you've got high grade laxity or rupture, or any sort of tendon disruption, that you have a stock of these little sort of mallet splints or any other splints that you may require, because any sort of mismanagement or suboptimal management acutely can again leave that athlete susceptible to deformities of their finger. And to be honest, hands and fingers are fairly unforgiving in terms of their deformities, that you usually get these thickening, or your finger looks a little bit like it's got a knot. It's a piece of string with a knot in the middle of it around that PIPJ, really. So you do have to get on top of them. Some may require surgery, and therefore you will go through some strict protocols that are based on that surgeon's input. Now, just to summarize really on this, so just to take you through some of those strapping techniques again. So we had the shoulder, we're applying the anchors, so you've got the zinc oxide underneath, and then adding on the zinc oxide. You're then just laying on some of those strips at the back, and then again, the ones with tension are those ones across the front. Again, think about the pre-positioning of the athlete when you do this. You may be too restrictive, and you may need to do that with that hand on hip, or potentially with that arm stabilized underneath. The elbow then, just again in summary, so apply your anchors non-circumferential, build up your strips in that crisscross formation. If you want to limit the valgus element, then you need those sort of medial strips. If you want to limit more hyperextension, put on the anterior strips and then lock the whole thing in. Next video is more to do with the actual knee itself. So just to give you a little bit of a clue, if you've done this upper limb part, do the lower limb strapping techniques. So again, similar strategies though. We've got the anchors, we've then got your sort of crisscross formations, and then what we've got is almost that layering in. So the principles apply the same as the upper limb, but again, the difference between making sure that this taping stays on really is critical. So if you are getting tackled, you clearly need to make sure that that is on stable wise. So then if we will go through the AC joint strapping, we did that star formation, didn't we? So we applied the taping over that AC joint and we pinned that down. The AC joint doesn't like traction, so therefore what we've done here is almost then take a bit of the weight out of that arm with those Adidas sort of style strappings, pulling up towards it, and then almost offloading the trap. Then you may also want to add on a little bit of a postural strip and make sure that upper trap doesn't kick in, and just lock that whole process in there. The wrist that we went through, so around that sort of back of the hand, dorsal aspect of the hand, you're building up those little diagonal patterns. Again, with the taping, use as much or as little as you feel the athlete needs. And if you need to bias that TFCC side, go from that ulnar styloid sort of just beyond there, and then almost pull towards that sort of thumb side of the hand. Think about which direction you are going to apply your tape. You may not want to go over the palm. Typically, I try and keep it as free as you can. And the good way to do that is maybe look at cutting the tape so you can incorporate stability, but without sacrificing anything across the hand there. And then we obviously had the thumb as well, where we're just trying to limit that overextension or abduction really of that thumb. So there's some of the really good techniques that we sort of used in a professional rugby environment with a lot of our athletes. You can teach them to do it. So in Okay, guys, there we go. So there is the lower limb and the upper limb sections complete. There's been a few little questions that have come ticking through, and I've tried to answer them, but if you haven't caught up with them, they're just in there. So in terms of footballers, there's a little question in and around ankles and how you manage them. I generally find that footballers don't particularly like any taping around that ankle, because that's going to reduce the feel. They potentially, if they reduce a bit of range, can they play the quality, the distance, the sort of big crossfield passes that they may have done and required to do in a game. Question about kinesio tape. I just use all of Physique's products. So if you didn't catch it at the start, again, all the products that I use within professional sport everywhere I've been has been Physique. I've tried other options, but they just don't compare. And please feel free to use that Grow Physio code to get a discount on all the products that are there, not just taping stuff. So really highly recommend Physique for them. Which tape is good for soft tissue injuries? Well, I guess it depends. Is the soft tissue the ligament? So something like an ATFL that we talked about with the ankle, I would say a more rigid tape is better. If it's a soft tissue like a muscle or a tendon, I find they're too restrictive if you use stuff like zinc oxide. So you could circumferentially just give it a little bit of a wrap with a tear light, but if I'm honest, I think that's where there's actually quite a nice place for putting the muscle or soft tissue on stretch in that injury sort of vulnerable position, and then apply that K-tape on tension. How many days should the patient leave the rigid tape on for? I generally find that if they're playing sport, it'll be one use, so they'll take it off. If it's someone who has had an acute ankle sprain, you don't have something like an air cast boot, and you're taping it, I would say probably max sort of 48 hours, unless you're using something like an underwrap, which again probably gives you a little bit longer. You just don't want that glue irritating the skin, particularly. Samantha's asked, you mentioned patella tendonitis. Any particular techniques for offloading the quad tendonitis? I don't generally go around the quad quite as much. I find that the hamstring and the quad, if you compress them, they can feel really restrictive for the athlete. If you imagine just tensing up your bicep, for example, and having some tape around there to tense that up, the same sort of thing will happen around that quad and hamstring. So it's generally not quite as good. What I've done usually is a K-tape option. So I've kind of almost enveloped the patella inside it. So I've gone from distal all the way around the patella to the proximal aspect, and then almost come over that quad tendon, and then potentially laid a few strips to help assist from a proximal to distal direction down through that quad. So they're the ones which usually tend to help. The other things which have been a bit irritated in the past. So we had one of our Olympic fighters developed a bit of a pinch onto that quad tendon. So she got ultrasounded, found that there wasn't anything particularly worrying going on, but she'd hyperextended the knee, the quad tendon being a bit pinched. And what we did with her is just actually taper the other way, where we normally would try and encourage full extension, wouldn't we, and control into that range. But what I did instead was almost restrict that end range extension. Depending on the sport you're in, that might not work. But actually, by taking her off her feet for 48 hours, keeping her out of that full extension, everything calmed down really, really nicely. So, yeah, I think that's all the questions that there are at the moment. One little question that came through earlier on was a little bit of advice around if I wanted to learn more about the Grow Physio Academy, what does that look like? So absolutely feel free to contact me if you want to find out anything more. In essence, they're presentations, webinars of this sort of fashion, plus the fact that you get access to like rehab libraries, assessment libraries, so lots of quick assessment tools that you can go through. There's all sorts on there, guys. So there's everything from like acute injury management and trauma management, almost like a sort of a physis or an ATMIF course, right the way through to calf injuries, hamstring injuries, how you manage ACLs from start to finish. And then there's quite a lot on there about sort of career advice, and that's where I'm going to try and kind of bump a lot of that over the next month or so, really. So you'll find that there's quite a lot more on sort of how to prep for interviews, maybe sort of how and what a normal typical day looks like is already on there, and anything if you're just trying to transition into this lovely world, because it is a really exciting world to be in. If anyone's in it who's here today, you'll know how consuming it can be. You can get athletes who will require you almost round the clock. There's sometimes quite a bit of travel involved. So it is quite a demanding world, really, but really, really rewarding. But that looks like that's it, guys. There isn't any more questions that have come through. So thank you so much for giving up your evening to learn all around sort of taping strategies, be better for your patients, your athletes. Real kudos to you, because you probably all have been in clinic or in uni today. So these can be long days, but well done. I'll send through the recording. It might arrive tomorrow morning if it hasn't uploaded to YouTube in time. But a big, big thank you from me, and I hope to see you guys at the next one, or potentially in early November for the taping course. All right, folks, over and out from me. Have a great evening. Bye now.